Bright sun was shining through my window today when I rise. Time's come to wipe away the slumber from these tired eyes. I said, it's time for rest when the work is done. When night is falling, yes, there's time for fun. But when the sun hits your eyes in the morning, take a good meditation.
You will not just live as I sing.
When the sun hits your eyes, just take a meditation.
Well, the rest of it, I tell you.
Hi, this is Tom Quine. This is the June 27th, 2018 version of the Humanity videocast. And my topic today is the recent debate between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, which took place, which I attended on Saturday, June 23rd, 2018, here in Vancouver. Now, the event itself will not be released as a podcast. We don't know if it'll ever be released on video, so therefore the people on the stage urged us to comment on social media and say what we could about the thing on social media. That's what I'm going to try to do today. So I want to just review what both sides said and pick out some highlights that I think you might find interesting, that I certainly found interesting. And I should say that where I stand on these two guys is somewhere in between them. I admire them both. I follow them both on social media. I listen to their podcasts and watch their videos on YouTube. And I agree with a lot of the things they say, but there's a lot that I disagree with on both sides, and there's things that frustrate me to death. And I wish that I could sit them down sometime or another and just have a little talk with them and kind of straighten them out on some points. But on the whole, I was most impressed with this event. This was a terrific event. And what I was most impressed with was, how is it possible that two philosophers can go and have a debate and pack the house? I mean, on the first night, this is the Orpheum Theatre, they sold out almost immediately, 3,500 seats. So they had to book a second night, which sold out almost immediately. So 2 nights in a row, 3,500 seats. When I was there, the thing that surprised me the most was when they introduced the speakers and walked them on stage, the entire crowd stood up and gave them a standing ovation of some length. And I got to say, I just have never seen that in my life, where so many people are so engaged with such important intellectual topics and philosophical topics, and the audience was they really hung on every word. They were keenly anticipating the answers to all the questions. They couldn't wait for it to, they did not want it to end, and they couldn't wait for the next thing. So, all to the good. No matter what happens, I think if people are really seriously engaging with these kind of deep questions, I think that's just a great thing, and more power to them. I'll have more to say about the crowd later, because the crowd was kind of interesting. But what I want to do today is just highlight a few things that I think were important and open that up for discussion. The first part of the debate was taken up with a discussion which was really initiated by Jordan Peterson of the areas where Sam and he really agreed, where there was an overlap in their discussion. And this went on rather too long, I think, but in the end, they more or less agreed that they are the enemies of fundamentalism and dogmatism, which we could have figured out for ourselves. But nevertheless, it was an important discussion because it highlighted a few things. First of all, Jordan Peterson stressed again and again and again and again that he is not a fundamentalist. He disagrees with any literal reading of the great religious texts. His reading is strictly metaphorical, and I personally think that's a legitimate thing to do. These texts are thousands of years old. They've influenced many people in the past and today. It's worthwhile to take a close look at them and see what's in there that's of any value. The interpretation of myths and religious texts through a psychological lens is a legitimate activity. Sam does not agree with that. He thinks that he worries, and he accuses Jordan Peterson of providing a cover for religious ignorance by painting a kind of an intellectual veneer on these old texts. I think Sam is out of line there. It's a legitimate thing to do. Yes, we can say that a lot of these texts, if read literally, are complete stupid nonsense. Fine. But why do they survive? What is the value of these texts to the human mind? What psychological needs are they answering? That's all legitimate to question. And by the way, I should say that I think Jordan Peterson has an unacknowledged debt to Joseph Campbell. Now, Joseph Campbell was a big name when Jordan Peterson was growing up, and I'm certain he came across him. Peterson mentions Carl Jung frequently, but he never seems to mention Joseph Campbell. There's a great documentary right now on Netflix called Joseph Campbell and the Power of Myth. Check that out if you like, and you'll find out that actually a lot of the themes that Jordan Peterson is talking about, Joseph Campbell was talking about 30, 40, 50 years ago, saying almost exactly the same thing. Jordan Peterson never mentions Joseph Campbell, and I'm not quite sure why. But in the end, they agreed that dogmatism was a problem, both in religious texts, but also on the left. Now, they are frequent critics of feminism and various forms of identity politics, viewing them as dogmatic. They confuse these with leftism and with Marxism, which I think is a fundamental category of confusion. But nevertheless, they're opposed to this kind of dogmatism. I hear less about the dogmatism of the right from these people, especially from Jordan Peterson. And I think you can make a major criticism of Peterson for saying that he would have voted for Trump, for never really criticizing the alt-right or the Nazis or Donald Trump himself. And in fact, he's appeared at several far-right events, and he appeared recently at a anti-feminist event that was organized by the Republican Party. And it was boycotted actually by some people in the Republican Party because of the presence of Nazis and neo-Nazis at the event. It was aimed at women, and I think it's thoroughly reprehensible for Peterson to be flirting with the alt-right. He's playing with fire and he doesn't seem to get it. Of course, we want to criticize Stalinism and Maoism and Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Of course we want to criticize those, but hey, what's the greater danger to, for instance, freedom of speech right now? Is it Donald Trump and the Republican Party? I mean, Donald Trump, who says that the mainstream media is quote unquote the greatest enemy of America, end of quote. Is it Donald Trump and the Republican Party, or is it political correctness? I mean, wake up. So let me go on to discuss a couple of the points of disagreement between the two speakers. And I should say at this point that the debate was moderated by Brett Weinstein, who is somebody I also admire, and he did just a great job. His role was a minor one, but when he did intervene, he made some extremely important points, and I'll return to those. So Sam's major attack on Jordan Peterson is that, look, religion is bullshit. Will you just admit that? There is no God. Can you just, answer my question? What does God mean to you? Well, Jordan came back and said, God means this and that. And, do I believe in God? I believe that you should act as if there is a God. Now, why does Jordan Peterson say that? Well, because in his analysis of the religious texts, he sees lots that is of great value. They are ancient stories that tell us important lessons, and these lessons are often codified into things like commandments. And these things should be followed because they are the results of millennia of human civilization, and you can't just throw out the baby with the bathwater because a literal reading of the religious texts turns out to be nonsense. If you just read a sentence, you can pull a sentence right out of the Bible and you can say this is complete rubbish. But Jordan Peterson says, well, if you put it in the context of the entire work and you give it the benefit of a metaphorical analysis, you find that there is things of value in there, and it's not worthwhile to simply say that this is garbage. And Sam would have none of that, and so they went back and forth. And then Brett Weinstein came in, and I thought he made an important point as an attempt to reconcile these two positions, in which he said that, look, not everybody in the world is as articulate and educated and is a neuroscientist like Sam Harris. And I got to say, you know, there's very few people I know who are as skilled at verbal interplay as Sam Harris. And Jordan Peterson came off a little bit the worse for that. But you know, that's the way it is. Anyway, Brett Weinstein said, look, not everybody is as sophisticated as Sam Harris, and so maybe these religious heuristics turn out to have some kind of value. And he said, you know, these are heuristics. What is a heuristic? Well, a heuristic is a kind of a rule of thumb. So you can have rule of thumbs in your life that are very valuable. Let's say if a policeman stops you and points his gun at you and says, raise your hands, it's a valuable heuristic to say, I'm not going to run away, I'm going to raise my hands. Okay, that's a good rule of thumb. There's other rules of thumbs, of course. Don't run through a red light because you could cause an accident. You know, that's what's meant by a rule of thumb. And so if you say, let's say that the 10 commandments are not strict, literal, fundamental commandments, but are actually just heuristics, they're just sort of a rule of thumb, then they start to make a little bit more sense. If you take, for example, thou shalt not kill. Well, you know, of course we know that Christians are killing all the time. They go to Iraq and kill hundreds of thousands of people. They go to Afghanistan, they send drones. Christians have no trouble killing. But if you view it as a heuristic, it kind of makes sense. In a heuristic, a rule of thumb, don't kill your fellow citizens. Try to avoid killing if you can. Yeah, we know that there are times when you have to kill, and we know there are times when you can justify killing. But as a rule of thumb, don't kill. Now, there's lots of cultures, certainly today and certainly in the past, that didn't have this heuristic, didn't have this rule of thumb. If you look at a lot of the primitive cultures, going back all the way to Vikings, you see that in Viking culture and in some parts of Papua New Guinea today, homicide is literally the cause of death for 1 man out of 2. And that's because they don't have, and they didn't have, a heuristic that said, thou shalt not kill. Look at ancient Greek society. They were killing each other with great abandon. You know, Ulysses comes back from the Odyssey and wipes out everyone who spoke to his wife, and that's viewed with, you know, with great applause. So, you know, for most of human history, we did not have a heuristic that said, thou shalt not kill. So Jordan Peterson's, to give him the benefit of the doubt, his argument is that these heuristics are valuable even today, and so therefore I'm going to behave as if there is a God that gave down these commandments, because these commandments are valid. They've been validated by millennia of human experience. These laws of Moses are based on sound principles, and I will obey them. Sam, of course, will have none of this. It's all garbage. Jordan's reading of the texts is purely subjective. He could read a dinner menu from a psychological point of view, and he could come up with things that were more valuable than reading the Bible. I think Sam's out of line on this one. I do agree with him that most of the Bible is rubbish, but you can legitimately make a metaphorical reading of the great religious texts, and you can get some value out of them. So the next point of disagreement that I think is of interest between them is what I would call a discussion between literalism and more metaphorical interpretations of the world. Now, Sam is a great rationalist. He believes in truth, but he believes in a kind of an interesting conception of truth, which is probably a variety of a correspondence theory of truth, where he will say, look, this is a brute fact. The Bible says this. Come on, that's a brute fact. And Jordan Peterson will say, that's not a brute fact. That's just something that's in a certain context, and you bring to that sentence not only the context of the greater work, but also you bring to it your own life experience and your own interpretation. So Sam will say, look, a rock is a rock. That's a brute fact. Okay, and you can't argue with a brute fact that that's just the truth, that's just reality. Not necessarily, because as William James pointed out quite a long time ago, you bring to every experience what you have in your own mind. You bring your history, your narrative, your culture, your interpretation, even to a brute fact like a rock. You're going to look at a rock, and you're not just going to see a rock. What is a rock anyway? A rock has no meaning unless you attach a meaning to it. I can use a rock to hammer a nail. I can use a rock to skim across the water, or I can use it to build a wall, or I can use it for whatever purpose. And when I look at a rock, I am bringing to it my truth and my objectives and my goals and my whole psyche. And so you can't just say there's a brute fact. When you're a human being, you also have layers of meaning that you add to it. And it's the same thing with a passage from the Bible or a passage from the Quran. You read it literally, you think, my goodness, this is ridiculous. But if you read it metaphorically, you say, okay, wait a second. What are they trying to get at here? Where did that come from? Yes, certainly part of it is ridiculous, but part of it, I think they're trying to say something here. And I think maybe I should pay a little bit more attention. Now, where this point starts to take on some importance is where Sam, for instance, will say again and again and again that it seems to upset him a lot that people don't necessarily agree that the jihadists and the ISIS followers and the radical fundamentalists actually truly believe what they read in the Quran. They say over and over again that they believe it, and so Sam is just baffled that anybody could dispute this. But if you think about it, a lot of these people, well, I mean, people will believe any bloody thing. There's lots of proof for that if it serves their purpose. And so it stands to reason that one should start from what is their purpose in believing this before, in believing this obvious nonsense, before you make a judgment. Now, we know that a lot of ISIS militants and Islamic fighters are driven by a lot of motivations that are not necessarily related to a literal interpretation of the Quran. As a matter of fact, a literal interpretation of the Quran is probably way down the list of motivators. They're motivated by political reasons. They believe that their tribe, the Muslim people, are being oppressed by the infidel. A lot of the young fighters are, of course, coming out of troubled backgrounds. They're alienated from society. They're not successful. They're disenfranchised young men. They're experiencing racism. They're experiencing discrimination in their life. And they see a chance to fight back. And of course, they're young men, and they want to go and grab a gun and fight against injustice. And they want to believe in a cause that's larger than themselves. And you know what? Maybe they want to have some sex slaves, and maybe they are motivated by very poor intentions. Maybe they're just psychopaths. Or there's a lot of reasons why people become jihadist terrorists. And a literal interpretation of the Quran is probably way down the list. And so I think that's where you make a mistake in doing a literal interpretation. And by the way, if you choose to interpret the great literary texts in a literal fashion, or the great religious texts in a literal fashion, then you're making the same mistake that the fundamentalists do, which is to say you're taking this stuff at face value, which it was never meant to be taken as, because it's internally self-contradictory. These are stories that you pull out meaning that is relevant to you. And we live by stories, and so people will pull out from the Quran whatever suits their purpose. The important thing is look at their purpose, don't look at the literal text. And that's where scientism, rationalism, and belief in facts can lead you astray. Okay, to follow up this point with a better example, Sam will argue that truth is truth, facts are facts. You can't argue with them. Facts and truth are value-free. This is nonsense, and I'll explain why. And this came out especially when Sam was interviewing Charles Murray, presenting Charles Murray as just an honest scientist who had uncovered some truths that needed to be heard, and truth will out. You need to listen to this truth, and what you do with it is your business. But it's value-free. I can give you an example, if you like, to illustrate my side of it, which is that facts are not always value-free. They have to be seen in context. And human beings always add a context. Human beings always have a story running in their mind. They always have a film running through their heads that they place these facts within. Okay? So let's imagine, shall we, just for an experiment, a purely objective social scientist working in Germany in 1935. Okay? He's not a Nazi. He's not a racist. Heaven forbid, don't call him a racist, because that's not how he feels. You can't look inside of his head and determine what he thinks. He will deny it up and down. He's not a member of the Nazi Party. But in his social science research, he has discovered that some interesting facts, and these are facts, these are verifiable facts. Fact number one, Jews are overrepresented as a proportion of the population. They're overrepresented in the legal profession. Jews are overrepresented among academics and university teachers. Jews are overrepresented in the business professions. Jews have a higher average income than the typical German. And so he's got all these facts, and he says, you know, just in the interests of science, just in the interests of getting the truth out there, I'm going to go on a lecture tour around Germany, and I'm going to reveal these facts, and I'm going to show my research. Now, what do you think that means in the context? So, you know what? Think about the context of what you're saying, and don't ever fall into the trap of thinking that facts are value-free. Okay, the last part of the debate that I would like to talk about was a discussion of morality. This, I thought, raised some important issues. Sam Harris, as we know, wrote a book called The Moral Landscape, in which he tried to lay an objective basis for moral behavior, a scientific basis for moral behavior, and based on the idea that the well-being of conscious creatures is the prime imperative. This is, if we're working on behalf of the well-being of conscious creatures, we are behaving in a moral way. And in the book, he brings up a thought experiment. He asks us to imagine two worlds. In one world, we have the maximum possible misery for all human beings. Human beings are tortured, their skin is boiled off, in our lake of fire, they suffer immense pain and sorrow throughout eternity. It goes on forever. So let's imagine that horrific world. And then let's imagine another world in which human well-being is maximized. People achieve self-actualization. They interact with each other in a civilized fashion. They behave with compassion towards one another. And people are basically able to achieve most of their goals and objectives. And let's contrast these two worlds and say, isn't it the case that moral behavior means trying to move the needle a little bit away from the bad place and towards the good place? Now, Sam Harris, obviously believes this, and he's argued for it again and again. Jordan Peterson called him out on this, and I think he made a valid point. He says, look, you've got a subjective criteria for morality there. Sam disagrees, it's subjective. I mean, how can you argue with the fact that you have, that maximum suffering for all people isn't bad, and something a little bit less than that is better? How can you possibly say that? Well, the minute you start using words like good, bad, better, and well-being, you're into the subjective land. And it's all very well to talk about this at the extremes. It's pretty hard to argue that the most extreme version of Sam's thought experiment isn't bad. It's pretty hard to argue that. But where it gets difficult is when you're in the middle zone. Because in the middle there, you're trying to make an appraisal of what's good and what's bad and what's well-being for people. And it's not so easy. I'll give you an example. You may say, and Sam Harris will say, that putting on the hijab for women does not serve their well-being, and many feminists will agree that women should have the right to express their sexuality and wear their hair whichever way they like, and they should not be forced to wear the hijab or any headscarf or any clothing whatsoever. They could wear whatever clothing they bloody like. and that's in the best well-being of human beings. But you will find many millions of Muslims disagree with you, okay? They have their own interpretation, and they think the hijab is a good idea, and they think that suppressing female sexuality, even probably the majority of Muslim women would agree that that is a good idea. A lot of women agree that you know, female genital mutilation is a great thing. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. So now you're into an area where you're having two subjective visions, and you can try to argue, well, this is best for people, and this is best for people, and this is not. But then you're living in a land of subjective interpretation, and that's Jordan Peterson's point here. That the basis of Sam Harris's entire discussion of this is a subjective discussion. Now, personally, I think that we do have objective criteria, scientific criteria, for determining what is moral and what is not, because the natural universe, not God, not culture, not us alone, gives us some moral imperatives when it says to us, survive or go extinct, you know, perish or persist, flourish or fail. Get out there and do the work and do what every species, every living species tries to do, which is to flourish on this earth. And in my view, what's moral is whatever serves human flourishing, and what's immoral is what does not serve it. And you can have a scientific analysis of what serves and what does not serve human flourishing, and you can apply science to this, and you can have a scientific basis for morality. But it's not Sam's idea. Well-being of conscious creatures, no, that's a purely subjective interpretation, and it's open to multiple attacks from several directions. So I think Jordan Peterson was correct on this point. Then Jordan Peterson got Sam Harris in what I would call a gotcha moment. And that is that he said, Sam, you've just written a book, and in the book you contrast one extreme version of a world in which human beings are endlessly tortured for eternity, and contrast that with a world in which human beings are happy, achieve fulfillment, achieve self-actualization, are able to achieve their goals and have maximal well-being. So Sam, says Jordan Peterson, really you just wrote a book about heaven and hell, didn't you? And you just wrote a book about morality that says we should move towards heaven and away from hell, didn't you? And this got Sam just a little bit tongue-tied for a moment, and he tried to object, but I think Peterson was really onto something there. And what he was trying to say, although he's not as articulate as we wish he was, what he was trying to say was that, Sam, you know what? You thought you invented all of this, but really you are a creature of your own tradition. And if you had taken a metaphorical interpretation of the great texts, you would have come to this conclusion, and you wouldn't have had to write your book in the first place. Because what you're saying is not significantly different from what the Christian interpretation of morality is, except the Christian interpretation is a metaphorical reading of the great texts, and you didn't even know it. So let me start to wind up here. I want to talk about the crowd, which I found fairly remarkable because, you know, Vancouver is a very multicultural place. We have an enormous Chinese and Asian population. We have people from all over the world. If you go into the supermarket, you're going to hear 40 languages before you walk out of the supermarket. But at this event, I would say that the audience was probably 90% male and probably 95% white. Very few Asians, maybe 2-3 handful of black faces there. You know, you did not see a lot of multicultural diversity, and that tells you something. That tells you something. I'm not sure what it tells you, but it certainly tells you that the following of Jordan Peterson, at the very least, is primarily white and male. Now, there's not a lot of white supremacists in Vancouver because if there ever was an idiotic strategy in a place that where whites are in a minority, and every day we see that immigrants are leading the economy and leading society in every aspect, still there are a couple of white supremacists. And at the beginning of the debate, before the debaters took the stage, we had a kind of a video display on the large screen. There was a fellow walking around in the lobby and interviewing people at random and saying, well, what are you expecting tonight, and what do you think about the two philosophers, and so on and so forth. And at one point he was interviewing 3 people. One of them was a male and 2 of them were very white females. And at one point during the video, one of the women flashed a white supremacist hand signal at the camera and gave her friend a smirk. And that shows that, yeah, there probably were a couple of white supremacists in the crowd. But on the whole, I would say they were not a racist crowd. I would say that they were deeply engaged with the philosophical issues. And on the whole, I think this was a very positive thing for society. So let me close on that note. In the comments, I have said some positive things about what Jordan Peterson said. I thought he made some really good points, very valid points. I think his enterprise of reading the great religious texts through a psychological lens is a valid enterprise, very good. But I think we need to be really cautious around this fellow, Jordan Peterson, because he believes that he's out there, you know, speaking truth. He's just presenting facts. He's just an honest social scientist who's trying to get his work and his research across to the people because he feels it's going to make the world a better place, whatever. But he needs to be more aware, I think, that the facts that he is promoting, the so-called facts he's promoting, are being used by others. In other words, they have a narrative of their own that they are inserting his facts into. And so this is why you're going to see white supremacists appear at his rallies. This is why you're going to see that his comments and his facts and his so-called research are really feeding some of the worst and most deplorable elements of society. The Republican Party, which is increasingly being dominated by a variety of fascism. You have the alt-right, you have the Nazis, you have the white supremacists, you have the misogynists, and these people are all being fed and nurtured by a lot of the things that Jordan Peterson is saying, and he needs to stop pretending that his words are value-free. Sam Harris is maybe less guilty of that, but also I think that both of them need to spend less time attacking the identity politics of the oppressed, and maybe a little bit more time attacking the identity politics of the oppressor. My last comments are on the after party that took place following the event. The party was billed as a swing dance. They hired a swing band and they hired a club, and anyone who had attended the event could go to the after party and take advantage of the entertainment. So I went along thinking, well, I like dancing, I like swing dancing, and I also like talking about philosophy, so yeah, I'm going to go to this party. Unfortunately, when I arrived, the party was a complete disaster. There was a 15-piece or 12-piece orchestra playing swing music at the, at a very high decibel level, such that you could not have a philosophical discussion without leaning over and shouting in your neighbor's ear. And as a result, people were sitting around quietly listening to the band. The other problem, of course, was that like the event itself, the audience at the swing club was probably 90–95% male. And yes, there were a few women there who were trying their best to have philosophical discussions at the top of their lungs, but they weren't interested in dancing. So there was no dancing, there was no philosophical discussion, and the after party was pretty much a bust. So that's all I have to say. I hope that you found some of these things I said are useful. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. I will be talking about other events with Sam Harris and other podcasts that they put out, but also I spend most of my time talking about other philosophical issues. So please subscribe, and if you can, come to humanity.ca and see what else I have on offer. Thanks a lot for your time, and best of luck to you.
You feel me? Selassie.